The excitement and enthusiasm undiminished on the second day of voting. It's the first round of parliamentary elections that will take place over a 6-week period. But what kind of government will emerge, and how much power will the military continue to wield? Are the lines of control really being redrawn? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna in Cairo. Millions of Egyptians have been casting their votes in the first of 3 stages of parliamentary elections. This round includes the country's 2 largest cities, Alexandria and Cairo. And this is what the voters have to say.
The presence of the people is more. The revolution has made an effect on all the people. Many people are coming before this time. We used to sit at home and know that there will be papers filled in with our name and with dead people. So this time we do all feel it's a big difference.
I think it's a good experience for all Egyptians to have a true elections and give his voice to the one who deserves it, and to begin a new time of democracy.
I didn't vote, and I will not do, because what's happening in the election and what also will happen is a farce. It looks the same as it was before January 25th, which means falsification will happen for sure.
Earlier, I went out to one of the hundreds of polling stations here in the Egyptian capital. For the second day, the voting proceeds smoothly. Egyptians going to the polls throughout the country. Organizers say they are delighted with the smooth running of the elections. The only problems have been those of logistics. The violence of recent days have not, it appears, impacted on the process at all. Criticism of the army remains, many insisting that it's got to step aside and allow for civilian rule. But in this democratic process, it's the army that have been playing a major role, guarding the polling stations, ensuring the ballot boxes get to stations on time. So the body criticized for undermining democracy is in fact ensuring that this exercise proceeds smoothly. But suspicion about the real agenda of the military still remains, and all are aware that the parliament that is elected will only have legislative power. The real power, that is executive power, will remain with the military, and it says it will stay in charge until there is an elected president in place. Well, to discuss what happens next, we're joined by our 3 guests. Hisham Qasim, he's a publisher and human rights activist. Rabab el-Mahdi, professor of political science at the American University in Cairo. And Hisham Safei El-Din, a former police officer. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Out on the polling stations there, I saw only soldiers guarding the polling booths. There was no evidence of police. In a way, this is almost an absence of a civilian authority out in the streets on what is a critical democratic process.
Well, as far as I see, I can tell that the police is doing the second part, securing the elections. The first part is the military police, which is the military part. So I myself, I'm talking about the experience that I witnessed during voting. So I witnessed a couple of police officers, low ranking, like captains or first lieutenant or something like this, in supervision of a major or senior military officer from the army. They have sufficient power or troops inside. I've seen inside the schools. I've been to 3 schools majorly because I had to vote my mother and then my wife and then myself. So I've seen the 3 of them. They have troops inside. And so far, there were minor reports about any violent actions or something like this. So I can tell that from security point of view, this is not the challenge in this election.
Yeah, so Rabab el-Mahdi, I mean, that absence or lack of police on the streets in a way reflects a vacuum. The military have filled a political vacuum, but there's no one really on the streets to fill that kind of vacuum of civil order, to maintain civil order, because it would appear the police have been largely delegitimized.
Not only was it delegitimized, it was, I think it was exposed for what it is, a brutal coercive force that has been servicing the regime and those in power as opposed to the citizens, I'm sorry. And the thing is, the military has not been willing to restructure the security apparatus for it to be able to pursue a different role. Rather, it continued to be the brutal coercive force it was. And hence, by now, 10 months after the start of the revolution, you can totally expect that there's no confidence in the police.
Hisham Qasim, many had predicted that there would have been problems with this electoral process given the intensity of the conflict in the past few weeks. Yet it appears almost as though that has energized the process rather than impacted on it negatively.
Certainly, yes. We did expect violence to occur, especially that the last 20 years have seen violence, and considering that there was going to be a much higher turnout in comparison to the 7-8% that appeared for the polls under Mubarak, we expected proportionally more violence. However, people have showed up. In lots of cases, you saw the perfect formula for trouble, like a mixture of secular and Islamists, and in the past it would have probably ended up with a fight or an unpleasant scene. And yet it seems to have gone very smoothly with very little irregularities.
Hisham Safei El-Din, why do you think that this is the case? I mean, as you said, this was a recipe for real trouble, given the fact that everybody had been truly angered over the past 10 days, and yet it has gone smoothly.
Well, apparently it's a pleasant surprise for all of us, but this is the type of, or the nature of the Egyptian people here. When they are challenged, they act differently, quite differently. And in this case, with some minor violations committed by some of the parties, I can say that it's going very smooth, and this has something to do with the understanding of the challenging period that we are passing now. We are crossing a very challenging period. We are redrawing our history.
Now, the other thing that impacted and threatened the elections was threats of a boycott. Many arguing that the process was illegitimate because it was still controlled by the military, with the military in power. And yet it does appear that that particular movement did not gain much traction, that those who were arguing that you can oppose the military and still take part in the electoral process would appear to have dominated. Rabab el-Mahdi?
Absolutely. I mean, the voices calling for the boycott were on the fringe. They're very marginal. Very few activists called for this. But actually, none of the political forces or main activist group present on Tahrir Square actually called for the boycott. And the other pleasant surprise that we've been seeing since the start of the revolution is that the Egyptian collective mind have been acting in unison and not necessarily following the line of activists or political forces. And hence, it was very clear, I think the protests of last week led to a very high turnout that we saw yesterday and today. People are voting the military out of power.
Hisham Qasim, I'd like you to pick up on that particular point.
Well, again, most of the voices calling for a boycott came from Tahrir, and unfortunately Tahrir is no longer really representative like it was during the days of the uprising when we ousted Mubarak. And people need a sense of law and order once again. Tahrir represented exactly the opposite of that, and I think there was a response that people wanted to take this process and bring about an elected government that would have a mandate.
Now, there would appear to be a problem here as well in terms of this emerging democracy. One of the processes is for a society to reorder itself. Some would argue that democracy is actually licensed to do things rather than to stop from doing things. Is there a sense perhaps that in this time as well there has become an increasing lack of self-control among some sectors of the society? Rabab el-Mahdi?
I don't think so. I think what we saw, and here I'm actually in disagreement with what Hisham said. I think it wasn't, Tahrir wasn't calling for a boycott. This wasn't clear in the collective chants or any of the present. Some activists within Tahrir were calling for the boycott. And I'd like to make that distinction very clearly, because those activists don't necessarily represent the bulk of Tahrir, which is not organized. And I think the law and order that we've seen is actually was very clear in the polling stations. Egyptians who break the law all the time when it comes to traffic were very disciplined yesterday and today, because for them this was a step forward for the kind of political system they would like to see. And again, I would be very cautious putting Tahrir as a contradiction to the electoral process, the elections that we saw. Actually, if anything, what we saw in Tahrir, the fearless confrontation of the security, in my opinion, forced SCAF and the security forces to have a proper elections that we saw with no irregularity.
I have to disagree, because again, the logistic effort that went into this election took months, you see, and I can't see how the violence that broke out in Tahrir and the attack and the attempt to burn down the Ministry of Interior when it reached that was the catalyst or what got the SCAF to arrange for this. I truly think SCAF from day one have been very clear that they intend to go back to the barracks. None of the top brass has any political aspirations. That's by definition the Egyptian army at present. And I think it had been planned all along to run the elections as we saw them. There was no pressure from Tahrir. Again, Tahrir is typical now of contradicting voices, because the bulk of the chants in there were talking about bringing down SCAF, putting an end to the military rule now, not wait till midsummer when we've elected the president.
Well, Hisham Safei El-Din, I'd like to take your view on that, on the two views we've had here.
Well, I think that the majority of the humble Egyptian citizens, they think that stability equals elections. So that's the main reason they went there. However, as the distinguished guest mentioned now, it's not all of Tahrir Square is calling for boycott. It's only some of them that are calling. So why? Because they see that this is not the environment to do this, and because of the bloodshed that happened during the previous days. So they have maybe a point, but the majority and the vast majority for ordinary citizens, they would go for the...
Do you think that there's any suggestion that because these elections have gone so smoothly, in a way the military is no longer under that kind of public pressure to hasten the speed of the handover? Do you think there's any sense of that, Rabab el-Mahdi?
Absolutely not. I think the pressure that was created by Tahrir actually pushed the military to fasten the pace of moving out of power. And now we have a clear timing for presidential elections, which is mid-2012, which is something that we didn't have. And I think the process of elections going smoothly is another indicator that this is exactly what Egyptians want. They want to build politically democratic institutions, and they don't want SCAF to remain in that very bizarre situation.
Hisham Qasim, your view on that? We do, as a result of those protests, have that presidential election brought forward from 2013 to 2012.
I don't think that the date 2013 was ever set. Okay? There were theories going around that it's 2013. However, everything SCAF said was that it's in 2012. It's true that they did have to set a date. Again, I fear that they might not be able to meet the date for logistic reasons. Again, we're not sure if the constitution is going to be drafted prior to the presidential elections or after the presidential elections. But again, I find no empirical evidence that there ever comes pressure from Tahrir. The responses to demands made in Tahrir have varied, and in lots of cases you can't see anything tangible that came out of the protests. For a lot of people, and if 8 million people demonstrated to oust Mubarak, Tahrir at best can carry 350,000. Plus other squares across the country where people show up. So we're talking about 7.5 million that never showed up again in protests, and SCAF are aware of that. You need that sort of pressure in order to really pressure them. But had it been Tahrir and presence uncomparable to the uprising that's happening now, that happened against Mubarak, he would have never stepped out. That is not enough pressure.
But are we at a situation here where you believe, well, from what you're saying, Hisham, that the military doesn't have any agenda to hold on to power. Do you believe that that is in fact the case?
Yes, definitely, because again, okay, two things. The military will be too powerful once a civilian president and government are in office for anybody to challenge the privileges they have right now. And again, I don't think anybody who would come to power in a country where the poverty belt is 40%, has reached 40%, and we're suffering from basically a chargé d'affaires who ran the country for 30 years and really stifled growth. There is a lot to work on the developmental indicators, healthcare, education, etc. And the next civilian rulers of Egypt will have one of two options: a collision course with the military or to start working on those files. And I really don't think that the military can be brought under civilian accountability and authority before 5 to 10 years. We begin that process. And again, the nature of the process that's going to take place in Egypt over that period will force SCAF automatically and eventually to come under civilian authority.
Well, Rabab el-Mahdi, would you appear with this rather long time frame that we've just heard there?
Absolutely not. I think what we're taking out of the equation here is the pressure created by popular mobilization. And this kind of pressure is not always accounted for by the number of people. It's both quantitative and qualitative. What we saw in Tahrir over the past week, I totally agree, was not as massive in terms of numbers like in Jan, but the intensity of the confrontations were actually had a role to play. So qualitatively, they were important. Again, I would have agreed with what Mr. Qasim was saying if we are looking at a normal process of democratic transition. But what we're looking at in Egypt is not democratic transition is only part of the process. The bigger part actually is about popular mobilization, is about a moment of revolutionary action. And revolutionary action, by definition, can fasten the pace of so many of the changes that we're seeking.
What do you think on this sort of time frame for a real handover?
Well, I see it from another perspective. I see the SCAF is going to handle the power. I mean, they are going to hand the power to the civilian authority, definitely, and eventually, and this will be during the time frame of 2012. Definitely is going to happen. But I see that what happened, the protest in Tahrir Square, from a different point of view as a security man. I see it a crisis that's been mishandled by the whole dynamics in the whole state. I mean, there was like 200 people complaining from certain things, then they need money and they need to be treated from their injuries, and instead of this, the Minister of Interior again chose and they step in somewhere where they don't belong.
But some would actually argue that that was intentional in order to provoke that type of reaction, not just ignorance or stupidity.
I don't think it's that way. I don't think that the Minister of Interior has lots of challenges to add one to their burden. However, I think that it was, again, a mishandle and a lesson that's never been learned from the Minister of Interior. In this case, I wouldn't step in this Tahrir Square unless they are looting or doing some vandalism in the museum or accessing the AOC as happened. This is what the security needs to find before they move.
Hisham Qasim, do you think that that lesson has been learnt? The intensity of that violence did result perhaps from the presence of the security forces on the square?
No, okay. What we have learnt, I think, is that Egypt does not have security personnel qualified to deal with riots. Yeah. In advanced parts of the world, usually there is a security force that is capable of dealing with riots without excessive use of force. Unfortunately, that's not the case here. And security sector reform is something I think will take at least 5 years. We're not going to be looking at a rapid change like a lot of people have been demanding and claiming that SCAF failed us because they did not reform the police force within this period. Recently, when SCAF fired 550 generals and to appease the crowds that were calling for reform, well, I think it was a terrible mistake, because that's exactly what happened in Russia, where people were laid off from the KGB and organized crime eventually started. Remember, those people are trained in crime. That is the case, and if 5 of those 550 generals begin a process like that, we could have a disaster down the road. And then add to that this young lieutenant who was targeting protesters' eyes. So the reserves actually are not with the top echelons. Unfortunately, they are way below at people who have just started their career. So I think a reform process is a 5-year process.
Hisham Safei El-Din, as a former police officer, do you think that this reform process can be hastened? Firstly, do you think that it is necessary at this particular time?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's not only reform, it's reconstructing the whole forces and changing the mentality of running this sector in the Egyptian lives. I mean, it's not the way it's going to be again after the revolution. Nobody's going to accept or tolerate any other violations. So they have to change this. However, I want to make my point clear here. I'm not blaming the Minister of Interior for this, but I'm blaming whoever gave the order to the Minister of Interior, while it's the Prime Minister rule to go and involve these complaining persons, not to kick them out of the square by the forces.
But who do you believe took that decision?
Can it be hastened? You didn't answer the question. I'm interested.
Yeah, very much. Yes, it's not that hard, but yes, it's gonna take time because we are a very big country in some challenges from different perspectives and different directions. So it's better take time rather than starting very fast and doing something that could topple or add more challenges to the challenging security situation in Egypt right now. So changing very fast wouldn't get the results that we are expecting, but starting to put the ideologies and reconstructing methodology, it will help. And announcing this to the people of Egypt, they would love this and they would give them the motivation to support the police changing instead of being in some position like challenging them, each other's.
Can you reconcile, though, that need of time for effective change and the impatience of the people with the pace of change? Rabab, do you think that is reconcilable?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the problem here is not that only the pace that the SCAF has been taking, but actually the lack of real qualitative action. So what we saw in something like the state security apparatus, for example, they claimed that they dissolved it. But now, and I know this for a fact, the same practices that we have been experiencing as activists are being done again. We're getting phone calls of threats. There are security forces meddling in the new parties, in the new political parties, and calling and putting different factions against each other. Our phones are being tapped. The same practices. So it's not just about the pace. It's about the political will to actually change and to start that process, even if it's going to take 5, 3, or 2 years. But being on the right track, which is something that so far we didn't have, the SCAF didn't have the political will to do.
We've just got the beginning of an electoral process here, but do you think, Hisham Qasim, that the apparent success of this first round very early in the stage is in fact a signal to bodies like SCAF and to those in authority that the people are determined to effect change?
Yes, certainly. Unprecedented the turnout, and today we still have more. And again, like Professor Mahdi says, the way we conducted ourselves through the election, so it's definitely an indicator that change has begun. However, I just want to disagree on a point on SCAF's political will. I don't think SCAF, by definition, as a military school of management, are capable of reform, economic or political, see, due to the school of management they belong to. And I personally refuse to engage SCAF politically. I can criticize a specific event, okay, like the massacre in Maspero, where it was a mega disaster, and whoever was in charge, somebody should be held accountable for. But I insist on dealing with them as a caretaker entity who open shop in the morning, close shop in the evening. I don't want them to even get a taste of politics, see? And with a time frame, and at the end of it, I want to see them out.
My thanks to our guests, Hisham Qasim, Rabab el-Mahdi, and Hisham Safei El-Din. And thank you very much for joining us here on this special edition of Inside Story. Your thoughts and ideas are welcome. please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.